why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome to the final webinar of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month from PlexTrac. We've been throwing out a lot of content your way, trying to keep everyone informed as to how to improve their cybersecurity posture, ways to do continuous assessment and monitoring. We are excited to wrap up National Cybersecurity Awareness Month with a panel, including a very good friend and esteemed guest, MacKenzie Brown, who joins us from Microsoft and the DART team, Detection and Response team. Is that what it stands for, MacKenzie?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Cool. But we've also got our very own Shawn Scott, who's our VP of Success and an esteemed background as well in cybersecurity, and then lowly old me joining in the discussion as well. But we're excited to be sharing with you some of our experience from our past and our current roles in observations that we've made along the pitfalls and successes of building a security program, and some of the challenges that many of us face. And so this is definitely geared for a good discussion around trying to avoid some of those pitfalls. What are some of the observations that we've seen? And then how do we, what are the key pillars for building a successful security program? Again, we're very excited to have MacKenzie join us. And then, we're going to kind of keep this as kind of an open panel. So definitely please, feel free to chime in on the Q&A, and we will answer questions as we can. But we're really excited just to kind of share with you some of our experiences and observations throughout the last several years. I think combined we have well over 3 decades worth of experience, in the cybersecurity space and building security programs. And so hopefully we can impart some knowledge and wisdom to everyone that's attending or watching this later. So without further ado, let's dive into the agenda. Each of us are going to, you want to go to the next slide there, Dallin? Well, okay. So was this the next slide? Sorry. All right. So we're basically going to discuss what we've seen. For each of us are going to kind of dive into each of our past experiences and explain what we've seen that works, what we've seen that doesn't, and then we'll dive into what are the key pillars that we all collectively have talked about as to how to build a successful security program and how to get started, or things that you might need to be focusing on now that you've been in have grown your security program. Is there something that you might have missed? And then happy to open up to Q&A for any further discussion and insight as well. And like I said, you can always go into the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom call or a webinar and type those questions in. All right, so let's kick it off with MacKenzie. MacKenzie, kind of dive in and give us your background and perspective and what you've seen and what you think works well.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Well, those pictures are definitely before and after in my career so far, I would say. I think now I've been in the MSSP space for exceeding the amount of time I was in the enterprise space, but yet the war stories and being in the trenches of enterprise tend to sink deeper in my memory than the ones rather working on the private sector vendor product side as well. So my background a little bit, I got started in security through state government, very GRC, governance, risk, compliance based, really not understanding security outside of just that compliance driven regulatory needs, security controls, technical controls, reading NIST as, the Bible next to my bed there, and just really trying to focus on it from that tangible side of policy driven. But then kind of quickly also coming from state government and moving into the private sector, there was a lot of differences that I think my experience is probably going to be a little bit different going from enterprise to actually being on not necessarily the sales side, but working with multiple customers all the time. So going from that program initiative on the enterprise side to trying to teach programs, but really developing frameworks. So I worked for Optiv for a short period of time doing R&D, creating program frameworks on enterprise incident management and application security, peer reviewing things on security operations centers, and thinking like, oh, this is great, tangible work. Like we're giving out lists of things to do to create programs. Still a little naive in my day and learning a little bit more outside of just technical writing, but how it applies realistically to the customers and clients we were working with. And then going from R&D into incident response, which is now kind of my bread and butter of just enjoying everything incident response because it's exciting and never ending. But really going from the proactive and reactive service side of things. So proactive being all of the preparedness, documentation, standardization, creating testing, big part of it, testing tabletops. I would say as far as that goes, it is really some of the common pitfalls that I was experiencing myself was understanding the enterprise side and what is realistic and feasible to accomplish, and then the misconceptions of developing program frameworks thinking this is realistic and we can do this. But that also requires a lot of work to integrate that into security teams, which is stressful and it's overwhelming. I would say that those misconceptions and the prioritization of those activities in general kind of superseded actionable security. I'd say the other pitfall that I saw a lot was having programs driven by products and vendors. So coming from the enterprise side, right, we definitely had a lot of vendors in our conference room and dealing with a lot of new products and trying to do the procurement process of things. But I would also say not focusing on things that are natively in-house and really focusing on fundamental configuration issues and security controls and how to work with what you have versus trying to integrate or implement some tool that's supposedly going to fix it and therein lacks telemetry in the long term of things. So I'd say those were the most common pitfalls that I was continuously seeing, which was making my optimistic side of security become a pessimistic side. Okay, I'm just going to go into IR then and put out dumpster fires every day because it's much more fun than being like, let's fix the problems. But so yeah, what I guess I'm just kind of going down the list here too. So like what I've seen work, I think the biggest thing that I've seen work is not just really good management, but executive buy-in. Executives that are involved in any sort of engagement. So now I'm with Microsoft, but even in any of these MSSP days, if there is a CISO or a CIO who is directly, doing that server room to boardroom type of translation that understands some of the common obstacles security teams face, and they're in the room, that's the biggest thing, because then you have some sort of level of executive buy-in and some support. And I'd see that is definitely one of the things that always works is when they actually sit and listen to the teams that are trying to implement some of these solutions. And then the other thing is kind of going back on what the other pitfall, what I do see work is the teams that utilize some of the in-house capabilities and functions of what they have right now from a technology side, and then using that to build on their processes. And then the other thing that I've seen work is investing in people, training your people, making them better. I think really exposing them to not just the products you use, but just general platforms that are in place right now and how to secure them and giving them that exposure. And even on the incident response side, kind of putting a fire under them and teaching them how to do an investigation. Just whatever you can do to train your people and expose them to those common things will just make them better and better experts, better experienced in different types of facets of security, not just the role that they assume. I think that's everything outside of my take on the pillars, which I think right now my take on them is just given, everything coming to mind and what I've covered is less is more. We really need to define our needs and define our thresholds and ultimately figure out how are we going to meet those with the people and processes rather than just technology. And then leveraging the technology we have, foundationally securing it, getting everything configured, having some sort of, whether it's a patching strategy or an upgrade, anything that's going to keep things managed holistically rather than just investing in new tools. Less is more is always kind of one of the main pillars, not getting distracted. Not because I'm just a vendor too. I work at Microsoft, but also like there are things that should be done to make those products work.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Your perspective is fantastic because you were at Optiv doing more of the proactive tabletop exercise and program building. Where I guess did you do much tabletop exercises at Optiv, or was it primarily like the program building and things like that?
So it was
like
both. It was
reference.
like a team transition. Started doing focus groups, developing frameworks, and doing the technical writing, and then performing workshops, going in and saying, here's how we're going to build your incident response program, and give them some sort of assessment and scoring on what they're doing and what they need to do. But that also, I'm not because I've become more pessimistic or anyway, but moving into the incident response side and doing tabletops and seeing some of those activities. This is all in the example of incident response, so I apologize, but going in and just seeing different stakeholders in the room, and not just the security team, but the pressure that I was having in the beginning of that role within that employer was focusing on, you should have this framework done, and there's some sort of report card on whether or not you're pass or fail, and then doing tabletops where people felt the pressure that they were passing or failing was a really kind of interesting contradiction to those two things.
Yeah, MacKenzie.
Yeah, MacKenzie, tabletops, it's one way that we implement proactive security, but it's also the sort of thing that it's almost like taking medicine for some people, right? Sitting down and we're going to take 2 hours out of or two maybe even 2 days out of our schedule. But they are so vital and so important to really flesh out and practice and run through your playbooks. What have you seen that is a successful way to get that enthusiasm, get that buy-in, get people engaged so they're not sitting there, playing, angry cats on their iPhone?
Well, I will say quarantine has not helped with getting people engaged. Not in a bad way. I know we like to think that it does connect us all, having to kind of circumvent these obstacles we're facing for how to do business. But doing these tabletops remotely is also kind of difficult because that engagement part is a big portion. And I don't know if the tabletop in itself is getting people excited. It really it's more on the back end of the business. It's who is the one driving the tabletops. I've had, in the past and then even with Microsoft and any of these engagements, I've seen some of the really successful ones and really valuable discussion that takes place is because the workshops or the security in itself, the drive to talk about them was by like the infrastructure and network team. It wasn't even by the security team, or it is by executive support, right? It's going to be by the CIO or CISO, and it's just going to be, of course, having everyone in the room makes a difference because people are likely to collaborate, and that defender collaboration is probably, I would add to the common pitfalls, is that we're all defenders, and in the tabletop, getting people excited is pushing that message that the infrastructure team, the developers, HR, legal, as much as we want them in the room, right? They're all defenders because they're supporting some sort of facet of the incident response process. And that it's not just on the security team's back, it's everybody's involved and everybody kind of takes that role.
So based on like the fact that you built some reference frameworks for like building out programs, right? And I think, I mean, yours were actually like specific programs, right? Like application security program, but then, kind of taking that experience and then matching it or marrying it with your tabletop exercises and your more proactive response exercises. What have you seen that actually works, based on, here were the reference frameworks that, we have, recommended, for specific programs, but then, actually getting into the nitty gritty of, hey, we're simulating a ransomware event or, or another, large breach. Has there been any, have you recognized, on both sides of that fence, things that truly are, seem to actually work, or like, reference frameworks maybe kind of fall short?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. So I definitely think frameworks in general only fall short by the person who's trying to consume them and apply them, because they can take away from necessary time to fix problems fundamentally we should have fixed. Device inventory, updating software, controlling identities and access, like some of the common things that aren't necessarily configured or controlled by just the security team. And then the security team takes hold of a framework, and all of a sudden we're trying to be able to perform forensics to the degree we need to do, or we need to have security testing on every application. And so I think frameworks are great in that aspect, but they can also be a distraction, or they could be pulled away as a distraction from ensuring that what's in place is properly working and configured and supporting also the rest of the corporate initiative or business initiative, what's supposed to happen for the organization. And so what I've seen in the tabletops in comparison, or just in incident responses, so some of the tabletops, for example, that we're doing now, it's not necessarily a table, it's more like a hybrid tabletop. But the idea is we focus on the adversary's path, what the attack path is, and what that attacker took, or what that attacker exploited, or some of the techniques or tactics that they used, which I think is as valuable as a framework, because we have to understand how those were successfully accomplished by the adversary. They could do that because we're not doing X control, which the framework provides, do X control, but we're not looking about the feasibility or plausibility that those types of attacks take place, and that our team now failed because we completed some framework and we have a score on some ISO score that we're certified, but yet we were still compromised. And so I can see how frameworks can be conceptually utilized in the wrong way.
Mm-hmm. And I would almost wonder, like what I've observed too is that, some folks may get so ingrained or entrenched in a framework or a program reference framework, like here are all the things that we have to do to have the, state of the art, world-class application security program, right? Yeah. And so they almost let perfect be the enemy of good. I mean, have you recognized that, where it's like, hey, because we've spent so much time focusing on this area, we've totally missed the ball on something else?
Yeah, I would say so. Starting in, the public sector, and really starting on focusing on the auditing side and thinking about all the controls. And a lot of them are policies, right? You can't, a policy in place doesn't actually thwart attacks or risk. It just sets a standard. And so I would definitely say that, again, it can be distracting. It's necessary and it's required, and it's sometimes regulatory required. You have to get it done. But it doesn't fix the problem. It's not necessarily a solution to the problem. It's a suggestion of a control to fix the problem, maybe. But what if you can't actually implement that control? Are you failing, or are you layering different defenses, or security in itself is a control? Your team that is eyes on glass, that's a control. Those are the people that can identify if something you couldn't put in place was potentially exploited. Now they can respond to it.
Cool. Yeah, so thanks, MacKenzie. I mean, like, great take, and I know we're all going to kind of come back together and kind of chat collectively around the key pillars. But I mean, it's great to get your perspective, because I think you've got an exciting view on many sides of this fence, and I think that provides a lot of value to the industry at large. But it helps kind of where we've all talked about, like, where do we need to, what do we really should be focusing on as an industry, and communicating to these programs that what are the key areas that really are the most important, versus things that start to get distracting. Shawn, how about you?
Well, first of all, I think it's amazing that so many of the things that I'm going to say share commonality with what MacKenzie brought up, because unlike her, who has this wealth of experience in many different environments, I've basically had 4 employers my entire life: the U.S. Air Force, myself, PlexTrac, and McDonald's when I was 16. Right.
The man.
And I learned more about customer interaction from no. No, but for those who don't know, I did spend the vast majority of my career in the United States Air Force, and I spent most of that time actually not in the cybersecurity realm, but in kinetic operations, right? That's a nice way of saying making things blow up, right? And actually, I walked into cybersecurity pretty late in my career. Some of my people might say that I waddled into cybersecurity. If you've seen me walk, but most of my time, I actually was an operator. Spent a good portion of my career flying as an air battle manager on the E3 AWACS. And through that job, I got to go to lots of nice, warm, sunny, and dusty climates around the globe, which actually is going to set the stage a little bit for one of the first things I want to talk about here, which is bringing the users on board. So an air battle manager, we're very analogous almost to a SOC director. My job was to ensure the chaos that ensues once your perfectly laid plan meets first contact with the enemy. And of course, nothing throws a plan into array or into the abyss like something bad happening, like a pilot getting shot down, or something like that. And I was always kind of the geek who was doing that sort of thing, and I liked to play with the new toys. And that kind of brings me to one of the first pitfalls I want to talk to you about today, which is the pitfall we see when we design security controls that are so onerous that the user is going to get around them. So up on the top right, that very ancient looking machine right there, that is it's called a Hook 112 interrogator. It's a neat little piece of technology that was actually really, really cool back in its day. And I was actually part of the team that tested this. And what this does is, as every pilot, even today, that's flying has a survival radio. And that survival radio is capable of doing some pretty neat things, even if the user is not in a state that they can interact. As it turns out, consciousness and maintaining consciousness is not assured in a high-speed ejection at 28,000 feet. All right, and so one of the cool things that this little piece of kit could do is actually interrogate those radios without the pilot interaction and send us the GPS location, which is obviously a very valuable piece of information. So I won't nail down the specific time or place we were going, but we had just completed testing on this particular new capability that we were really excited about, because quite frankly, I knew a lot of these people, right? And so we were getting ready to deploy the aircraft, and we wanted to deploy this capability, and we hit a wall. And that wall was that we did not have the proper FAA approval to modify the aircraft. This isn't a security story, but I think that the analogy is actually very, very ripe. Basically, if you've ever been involved with aviation, modifying airplanes is tough from a regulatory perspective, from a control perspective, and for good reasons. However, I'm going to make a bold assertion is that whether you are a military operator or whether you work in sales, that you care deeply about your job and your mission. And you need to get the job done, and you want to get the job done, and you want to do the right thing. But the definition that users have of what the right thing is may not be the same definition that we as security professionals have of what the right thing is. And when we present obstacles to them, sometimes and most of the time, they're going to find a way to do what they think the right thing is. So in this particular instance, I won't say who it was, but there may have been a golf cart that drove stealthily back and forth between aircraft along the flight line at 3 a.m. before we launched the fleet, crawling through the bellies of airplanes through cargo hatches and making a couple minor tweaks. But, obviously I could go on and on the number of times that I've seen mission take priority over security. And it's not because people are bad, and it's not because users are bad. It's because they truly are trying to do the right thing. It's just they have a different definition of what that right thing is. So while your organization may institute controls and say, that's great, I'm going to put in place processes that people can seek exceptions to policy. At that point, it's too late. Once the user has been trying to deliver that thing that is necessary for them at 10 o'clock at night on a Thursday, and they can't do it, and they find the workaround, they're going to keep using that workaround. They're never going to go back, and they're never going to use the formal processes. Information security is a part of risk management. It's not risk elimination. And we have to accept, much like, MacKenzie was just touching on, is that if you don't have the buy-in from all the stakeholders, and ultimately the most populous stakeholder is the user, then the controls are going to fall flat on their face, and people are going to find ways around them. I've seen everything from setting up rogue satellite-based internet connections in Iraq to circumvent, firewalls, to using personal laptops with pirated software to do mission planning for very, very sensitive missions because there were technical controls in place that we needed to get around. Other pitfalls that I've seen, and one that's probably very common to people here, is purchasing solutions without clearly defined requirements. And I know, MacKenzie, that you talked about this a little bit. But one thing I want people to keep in mind is that even in implementing an open source solution has a total cost of ownership, and it ain't free. Someone has to be trained on how to use that. Someone has to be paid to implement any solution into your environment. But most importantly, someone has to be trained to sustain and derive value out of the solutions that you purchase. And all too often, what I have seen is people that purchase blinky light solutions, if you will, without really doing a thorough analysis of the total cost of ownership and properly resourcing their people to derive value from these solutions. It's actually two problems. Do we have a solution that meets our requirements, and are we resourcing the solution beyond cutting a check or a purchase order to implement it in our environment? Sensors, they need to be tuned continuously, and it's got to be someone's job to respond to alerts. And I would posit that even if you have outsourced to an MSSP, there has to be someone whose job it is to answer the phone and take action. You need to have boots on the ground. There has to be an interlocutor that is managing, first of all, just for oversight. Are you getting what you paid for? And if you don't have someone evaluating that, then you're almost certainly not getting the value you paid for. Our customers at PlexTrac keep us on our toes all the time, ensuring that we're providing them with the service they need. And that happens because I have engaged people on the ground who are constantly working with me as a partner to ensure the success of the solution. And so if you don't budget for that, it's not gonna work. So what have I seen? What I've seen work? What I've seen work is collaborative solutions that do, in fact, take into the requirements and the business needs of all the stakeholders that are involved. After I retired a few years back, I spent some time running my own consultancy here in beautiful Boise, Idaho, and doing security assessments in the civilian sector. My first couple were quite humbling because I came, from an environment where if I had a recommendation for a control, I was the authority and it was going to get implemented, right? Whereas now I'm providing a list of things for someone that I have no command and control over and asking them to implement their environment. And those first few outbreaks were pretty humbling. It's like, yeah, that's great. I couldn't get any work done, or my productivity would tank if I implemented your solution. Go home, come back to me with a solution that is going to work for everyone and it's going to allow me to continue to operate with the least disruption as possible to my current business processes. So let me try to put a little more concrete spin on this. And let's take an example of a solution that's becoming more popular now. I wish it was universal. That it can be a true win-win. All right. So for decades, we've levied these really unrealistic credential requirements on users. Have yourself a 12-character password, complex, one of each for all the typical suspects. It's got to be unique. You can't use it with multiple sites. You can't write it down. You got to memorize it, right? That's just not going to happen. Okay. So we've now got some great solutions in the terms of things like password vaults, right? A simple solution. Now, password vaults are a trade-off. There have been some very well-publicized security issues with even some of the best trusted and most well-known password vault, providers. However, this is managing risk, not eliminating risk, right? We are accepting a trade-off that we are providing a solution that the stakeholders will accept, they will embrace, they will use, that might even find is convenient and increases their productivity. Whereas, is it as perfectly secure as just having everyone memorize 500 complex passwords? No, but that's never going to happen, right? So that's the sort of thing when I talk about what works. It's finding that right balance between reducing risk in the environment, but offering realistic solutions that can be implemented. So my take on the pillars, I come once again from that DoD background where we never do anything unless we can tie it to a requirement, right? Whenever, I spent some time on the air staff in Washington, D.C., out of the Pentagon at Andrews. And whenever I would see a shiny new toy, I got to have this. This is awesome. I want this. My people are going to love it. The very first question that any of my leadership asks me is, what's the requirement? Show me the document. Where has someone identified a gap in our capabilities? And so how do you get to those requirements? Well, you get to those requirements by first taking a step back and saying, what are my goals? Your goals define your objectives. And obviously we all have the same goal when it comes down to it. We want to avoid the breach, right? We want to avoid the bad thing happening. But that doesn't mean that everyone's particular goals or objectives are going to be identical to get to that end state of breachless world, right? You're going to need to set goals that are congruent with your current level of maturity. And maturity does not equate to size. I get to work with a lot of different size organizations these days. And I've seen very mature programs at smaller organizations, and I've seen very immature programs at very well-known names that everybody would understand and would be shocked at the level of immaturity there. So I think taking a little humility and assessing where you are at, and then identifying those, what goals should I be setting? So I generally have always classified, 3 levels of goals. If you're at that early stage, and even if you have a large program, if you've never taken the time to properly plan, the very first thing you've got to do is get the basics right. And so the first goal should just be an understanding of your operational environment. MacKenzie, talked about the simplistic, assets and software inventory. Great. Do I have that? Do I know where everything is? Because it's not realistic for me to set a goal to achieve a changing metric if I don't even have a baseline. And so if you haven't established the baselines in your environment, how am I doing my vulnerability management? What percentage of my machines are being scanned? How long is it taking me to patch this thing? All these things in my environment. If you don't have that baseline, you can't move to the next phase of goals, which is then simply identifying not yet. I want to decrease the number of unpatched systems in my environment by 10% next year. Well, that's great, but what's the cost of that going to be? Because you really don't know at this point. So the next phase of goals is pick what you want to change. What do you want to move the needle on? And throw resources at it. And don't even try to get yourself into a tizzy over numbers that I want to reduce this, or I want to enhance this by this metric by this many points, because you don't know. You don't have the data. It's not until you, through trial and error, spend resources, spend effort, and those resources can simply be time, can be manpower, right? And then be able to do the analysis of, okay, was I successful in moving the needle? If I was, what was the resource requirement? Is this an acceptable resource requirement? Can I continue to pay this bill? And then take that to really move into that next stage. Now I've got my metrics. I know how to, and I have processes in place to start tracking things like mean time to detection, mean time to remediation, looking at numbers and percentages of unpatched systems, even carrying that through to compliance, to frameworks, percentage of non-compliant things in a regulatory framework that I have a requirement to meet. It's only at that stage that your goal can really mature to wanting to set specific metric-based numbers on how you want to move the needle. So, to sum it up, I come from the perspective that the only pillar is, what do you really want to get done? What's your requirement? There is but that, and you're going to need to refine your goals to continue to get towards that desired end state based upon where you're at in the maturity of your program. And you're only going to know where you're at in the maturity of your program through concerted effort. You're going to have that C-level buy-in. You're going to have that executive support that MacKenzie so eloquently talked about, because nobody wants to sit down and talk about, doing analysis at this base level. They just want to start rolling up their sleeves and getting the work done. And I appreciate that. I'm an operator at heart. Give me my weapon and point me towards the enemy, right? And that is what we need as leadership. Need to do as far as our role in this process is yank our people back a little bit, bring everybody together, establish those goals, and then move out. And that about sums it up. Dan, I'll let you take over.
Yeah, no, I got one question though. I think you brought up a good point about how, practitioners can get very focused on the technical issues and meeting to the letter of the, the law, so to speak, on the framework, and to the point where they're going to bypass it, right? How do I punch a hole through this firewall because I got to get some work done, right? And what would be your take on the actual how do you find a balance between those things as an organization?
Yeah, well, once again, I think it starts with planning. I think that, prior to the implementation, we always talk about change control boards, right? That is a administrative aspect and administrative control of a mature security program. And we say that those change control boards need to have representation from all stakeholders. I think all too often that's lip service, right? You have a change control board that's primarily made up of IT staff, maybe some C-levels that are involved in the risk management space, maybe somebody from legal, and then maybe one or two folks from business ops. But the real impact is going to be primarily upon business operations. And so if the business operations people don't have an opportunity to convey, their equities and their concerns early in the process, it's just like with software development, right? If you don't get user interaction and user feedback early on, you're going to wind up rolling out stuff that you're going to have to go back and do twice as much work to fix. We've never done that at PlexTrac, but we promised because we bring in our users. But then I also do think you do need to have some element of reactive mode, right? And so there does have to be a very well-greased process in place that users can get resolution to the request for acceptance or exceptions to policy early and quickly, and feel confident that someone's taking that seriously. Because if it disappears into, send you a request to, this service account and someone will get back to you in 7 to 10 days, that doesn't help me for the report that's due tomorrow at all. And it doesn't help me get the mission done. So if the process to grant exceptions and to rapidly change things isn't well greased, no one's going to have confidence in it and no one's going to use it.
You talked about making exceptions and making exceptions. And then earlier, productivity and making changes that doesn't necessarily, or people don't want to make changes that inhibit productivity. But I feel like I've recently come across conversations where I'm making the argument for things like MFA, where I'm like, this can actually circumvent a host of issues. And if I'm arguing it in the sense of IT admins should, at minimum, administrative-based accounts should have MFA, and I'm still trying to justify that. I mean, at what point is there kind of a balance between not inhibiting productivity, not giving them one thing and not overwhelming them, but then having some things where you're like, well, you should really just do this. Just do it. Just put MFA on.
Yeah, I think there's a fine balance, because at some point you do have to have accountability, right? And we're all adults. And that's where I think leadership needs to, to communicate. Why are we doing this? Okay. And what are the impacts? And be realistic and have open conversations. All right. We're implementing MFA because by you taking this additional 10 seconds to go to your phone and pull out a 6-digit code, or to put your finger on the fingerprint reader, that is going to save you in the long run countless hours when your systems are unavailable to you. And bringing up the historical data. Hey, remember that time last spring when these guys walked in and they pulled the plug on every one of your hosts, in the marketing department, right? How much work did you get done? And if you count out the number of times that you have to take 10 seconds out of your day to ensure that that bad thing doesn't happen. So I think that at some point, yes, there are going to be burdens of implementation. And just as an aside, one thing that I really do like, and I get a chance from my perspective to see a lot of the ways that people who are consultants report and provide feedback and recommendations for security enhancements. Those organizations that do provide some sort of communication on the level of effort to implement a control, I think that's good, honest communication. And it's really valuable to the end user who has to implement these controls. So, unfortunately, we're never going to get to a perfect world where every control is going to have no burden of implementation. But when those burdens are there and we've whittled it down to the minimum possible burden, it's like, hey, we could ask you to type in a 6-digit code, or I could give you, 2 pages of 16-digit keys that are one-time use that I need you to go and use every time you log into something, and start making those distinctions and the alternatives clear. I think a little bit of education goes a long way.
Great. Okay. I'll dive into my kind of take on things. I have this handy meme about, say maturity one more time, just say it. and the reason I came up with this one is not that maturity is a bad thing. And it's definitely, not it becomes evident, who actually is doing a good job. And that's based on what we would say maturity is. I think it gets overused and it's a nebulous goal when you're saying like, we want to have a mature security program, because that's not really defining what your end state is going to look like and how you get there. And so I think that maturity itself is a result of good process, and it's a result of good planning, I think, like Shawn alluded to. Just quickly, my background, I've been in cybersecurity my whole career, so almost over 15 years now. I started in the Department of Defense, building out a small program. I think one of the things I experienced early on is that you will consistently have not enough people on the security team to do a lot of work. And so you start to get overwhelmed with all of the things that you think you need to be doing. And so you start to get, fatigue regarding, we've got to react to this point solution or this problem that we have because something was identified in some kind of scan, and so we go and buy a point solution to solve that problem. And then it starts to become whack-a-mole with different tools, like I think MacKenzie alluded to earlier. You start to get all these different tools for point solutions, and now your whole team is primarily focused on the tools, keeping those up and running, and not actually moving the needle forward with the security program. And what are the actual processes that we need to be putting in place to move forward. You start to get complacent as well in this environment. We have all these tools that they're just going to tell us everything when it's wrong, and we'll just go be able to fix it. And that's not the right mentality. My experience has shown that the more proactive you are in identifying where can an attacker, find the crown jewels in our environment, how can an attacker get in, being able to try and stay at least in lockstep with what techniques and tactics are out there in the world today have been my experience, being able to, grow and mature your security program. But I've worn a lot of hats. I've been a penetration tester. There was nothing more discouraging than doing a fantastic job in an assessment. Doing your job as the pen tester, identifying the findings that need to be fixed and the high priority issues, and then coming back a year later and realizing that they did none of those, and you're basically rewriting the same report. And so it has a lot to do with organization and process, right? And I think what the pillars that we're going to conclude with, are primarily related around actually doing the harder work, which is the planning and the process and the daily procedures that actually move the needle forward, and not relying on tools and technology to solve those problems, but identifying these are the problems we're trying to solve. We're going to do these manually at first, and then go and invest in the tools that help us automate that work away. And so my exposure has definitely been around people being in a more reactive state, and not getting the buy-in that you need from the rest of the organization, like we've mentioned before. Having a limited budget at first, so you're really trying to scramble for as many resources as you can get in whatever capacity, and not really being able to convince your leadership from the beginning, like, this is why we need to invest in security now. And then all of a sudden a breach happens, and now you realize you get this influx of cash, you get this influx of money, and you don't know what to do with it. I mean, it's genuinely a problem when you now have all this investment from the organization, and they're saying you need to make sure this doesn't happen again, and that can lead to second failures, in that you can't just throw money at a problem, anything in life, but and expect it to go away. And so having a good plan in place and being in lockstep with your leadership is what is the most important aspect to having changed the culture from a more reactive, ignorance is bliss kind of state to being proactive. I think I might be getting fished right now. I need to go report this. Having people on their toes at all times is the best culture you can provide, within your organization. So, I mean, I definitely relate to all the things that you guys have mentioned. What I have seen work is being in a more proactive state, and definitely getting buy-in from the top. Being able to communicate effectively. As security professionals, a lot of us are more technologists, and so we have trouble being able to communicate. And I definitely experienced early on in a lot of security organizations, they brought this immense amount of fear, or this immense amount of the sky will fall if you don't do this, right? And not putting it into the context of the business impact, or the impact to the agency, or to the warfighter, whatever your your environment was. And so so then that actually led to problems, and you start to get into this combative state with not only the end users, who you just took away their administrative privileges and you didn't ever explain why and how this is a problem, and you've got leadership that hasn't really bought in, but they now are trying to manage these political will powers between the evil security team and the rest of the operational group. So it starts to become a toxic culture. And so what I've seen definitely work is being proactive, understanding that could potentially be a problem. So every control that you're going to implement, every program that you're going to put in place from a security perspective, you need to understand, who does this impact outside of just the security context, so that the business can actually say, like, okay, we get it, and you've communicated that clearly, and that clears the path to achieve your objectives so much easier, right, when you have buy-in from the top. My take on the pillars is definitely being proactive, being, trying to get out ahead, or at least in lockstep with what's going on in the world today, and not getting focused on being a tool-driven program in a solution-driven program, but actually having those processes in place and letting the problems that you're trying to solve today drive the tool investment or the solution investment for tomorrow. So that it can't be the reverse. Otherwise, you just end up having a lot of shelfware. And we definitely saw that from the compliance perspective too. If you're driven to just check a box with your compliance, you'll go buy, a solution just to say that you have it. And we saw that a lot. It's like when I was an auditor, I saw this a lot. It's like you have a wireless firewall for, a wireless IDS, but it's not even configured. You just have it turned on and it's not doing anything. Yeah. And that was just to check the box that we had a wireless IDS, and so it's the wrong mentality. And so being driven more towards, having the right mindset of what problems we're actually trying to solve and what are the biggest threats to our organization are the key building blocks to understand here's where we need to go as a security program. So we only have a few minutes left. Go ahead, MacKenzie.
Oh, I'm just having vivid flashbacks of, middle school and practicing for earthquakes and sitting under the desk and getting in the doorway, thinking this will never happen to us in Idaho. And then what was it this year? All of a sudden we get an actual earthquake and I immediately got in the doorway. And it's that motive, that mindset is we're going to teach earthquake training, but cyber training and be this will happen. Let's just focus on it now, not wait until, the day where we didn't have earthquake training.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great analogy too, is that you're not, you hope the bad thing doesn't happen, but if you're training for it, you at least can be prepared when it does, right?
You also touched on a really good point too, not to be sensitive to time and not to take up too much, but the why wait for a breach to invest in it and everything. And that's kind of one of the things that I always try to bring up is recycling or making an opportunity out of incidents. So maybe you just have a phishing incident or hopefully not a ransomware based one, but some types of the data that exists. We've experienced this historical data, like you said, Shawn, something that has happened that is tangible data and using that as justification to go forward and not waiting for a breach, but saying, hey, let's just go through this proactively. We already experienced it. Let's walk through it one more time. How do we do this again? So it doesn't happen, but.
Yeah, no, I think that's great insight. So let's move on. We've got a few minutes left. We want to kind of close out. I think we've spoken a lot about these, just to kind of highlight, here's something that from our perspective you guys can take away, right? And whether you're an organization that has 200 people on your security team, or 5 or 3, or even it's just these are what we have experienced to be the core pillars for building a successful program. They're not the only pillars, but these definitely we feel have to be in place in order to set you on the right path. Like I mentioned before, having a proactive paradigm, a proactive mindset, doing those training exercises of hiding under the desk when you think there's going to be a fire, an earthquake, being able to have a way to simulate phishing and other potential attacks and who to contact, doing tabletop exercises. And it really starts with what problem are we trying to solve? Do we understand the context of our environment and where our true risks and threats are? So it takes some actual planning and before you even turn on any kind of tool to start throwing alerts, you should really have a purpose for that, right? Understanding this, we're actually trying to detect this. And we feel some of our biggest threats are from this vector. And so we need to be able to see if we can detect these things and being in this proactive mindset. And that kind of leads into measuring the right things, right? Don't just measure how many things were blocked at the firewall, right? I mean, don't measure things just to measure things. Have a purpose with that. And then verify and validate that these controls that you're measuring are actually working. And that ties back to pillar one of being in a proactive mindset. But things like mean time to detection, response, and remediation are important. I mean, MacKenzie, I don't know if you have any any insight into like some of the metrics that you encourage, your customers to measure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, like it sounds silly, but some of the foundational simplistic ones mentioning earlier, like how long does it actually take you to push out a critical patch, but not just any critical patch, to like your high priority assets, your domain controllers, your servers, then your endpoints, prioritizing those. But that you mentioned that the mean time to respond, remediate, just measuring how long it takes you to perform activities can be a big deal, because we were talking about all these disparate teams and defender collaboration being an issue and toxic culture. Well, if one team is asking you, you need to put out this critical patch that Windows has messed up again, you need to push it out, then, and it's the infrastructure team you don't get along with, I mean, how long will that take? How do you prioritize that or create that positive culture? And those types of response metrics and having data to back it up feeds into the culture as well.
Yeah, and I think and leading right into culture, right? I mean, I think we've all experienced a very toxic culture where, every day is a battle, right? And the security team is so demoralized because they can't do what they know is right, because they know that everywhere they turn is going to be an uphill fight against somebody that doesn't want you to do that. And so that is an important piece that is an art, I would say, in my experience. I don't know what your guys' experience has been, but you do have to play a political game within your organization. And if you don't do that, you're not gonna last, right? In terms of something bad will happen, and or you're just gonna burn out and leave. So I don't know if you've experienced any of this as well, Shawn or MacKenzie, but I know I have, and I definitely left a job once because it was like we're not getting anywhere, right? And I'm just too discouraged every day, so I'm going to find another avenue where I can feel like being successful. Yeah.
It's just Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We all need that validation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it also is an important part of the program, in that when other users outside of the security team or the IT team, or people that may not have a deep understanding of the technicalities of cybersecurity, but if they're engaged and they understand what some of the risks might be for their behavior and their activity, everybody wins, right? And that helps show that you're actually partnering with the organization, rather than just being this, we're going to turn this off because it's bad, right? And then I think, Shawn, you spoke to it earlier as well, but we're all in the business of risk management at the end of the day, right? You can have the most secure system in the world, and it's sitting in the bottom of the ocean, providing no function whatsoever, right? And so being able to put things in the context of business risk and enterprise risk are vital, right? And communicating effectively and building that trust within your stakeholders and your board and your executive team, that just starts to trickle down to the rest of leadership in the organization. I mean, I don't know if either of you have any other insight there. But.
No, definitely agree that, security is a business function. I think that's the evolution of it now. It's not if, but when, but it's also, okay, but when it happens, how are we going to address it? And a lot of those response decisions are business decisions, especially the types of threats and attacks that are out there, that we're making business decisions on attacks and how we respond, then we should make the same business decisions that security is presenting from a risk model point of view of, we need to implement this, or we need to make these changes or change user behavior in this way. because of this risk before it happens, or this very valid threat that could occur.
Yeah.
And if I could make a plug, I think that this is changing, but it hasn't changed fast enough. And that is your security program needs to have its own line item in the budget. It does not need to be subordinate to your information technology budget, because it's always going to lose to availability at the end of the day. Confidentiality and integrity will lose to availability if your funds are commingled in the IT budget.
Yeah.
But at least you have an IDS.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're just at the top of the hour. We want to be respectful of people's time, but we also do want to open the floor for any kind of last questions from our audience. We do appreciate you guys, joining us today. And we'll maybe open it up for like 1 or 2 questions if we have them. Otherwise, we can sign off. But if you have a question for us or for MacKenzie or Shawn, please chime in now. All right. I don't see anybody chiming in, so that's great. We must have answered everybody's questions, and now they're set up for success in a good program. But we really do appreciate everybody joining us today. And if you're listening later, you can always reach out to us, info@plextrac.com, and we're more than happy to just answer any questions just based on our experience in security, not trying to sell you anything or anything like that. Because I think all of our missions, regardless of who we work for, is to make sure that everybody is building secure programs and ensuring the trust that their organizations have with whatever their business or mission is. And that's what our mission is at the end of the day, is helping the betterment of the whole. So with that, MacKenzie, thank you so much for joining us. We are so privileged to have you. You have an amazing background, amazing experience and expertise, and so it's very helpful to have your insight. And hopefully the audience, has taken a lot away as well from that. Shawn, again, thank you. And with that, we will sign off and let you have your afternoon.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Cheers.
you.